All right, so I am going to start my presentation here. Hopefully this works on this Zoom setup. So to start, my presentation and paper was about looking at alternate forms of suspension besides just the most common three of suction, vacuum, and pin lock. So we all know that suspension is really, really important. If you have bad suspension, it can cause pain and problems with the residual limb. Or if it's really, really bad, then you can have problems with the prosthesis falling off and the patient taking a dangerous fall. So obviously, suspension, really big deal. You want really good suspension if you can have it. So, but because we only have those main three options, if we had more, in theory, you would have, because there's more options, you could end up having more satisfied patients, more patients that they get a type of suspension that works really well for them. So that's kind of the goal. The other types of suspension that we're going to be looking at today are hook and loop suspension, in which it's just Velcro basically, and a magnetic lock suspension, which is basically the same thing as pin lock, except it's a magnet at the bottom instead of a pin. It's just a magnet. So those are the main things we're going to be looking at. And we're going to be looking at them in a variety of factors to compare them to the most common types. And then we will go ahead and see where that leads us at the end with the conclusion. So to start, we're going to look at pistoning. Obviously, pistoning is when there's the downward movement of the prosthesis during swing phase because you don't have a perfect fit. And even if you have like as best a fit as you can get, you're still going to have some amount of pistoning, but it is considered to be, if you have less than 1 centimeter of pistoning, then that's considered to be a good fit. So that's the marker that we're looking at most of the time. And in our first study that we looked at, we compared magnetic lock suspension to pin lock in terms of how much pistoning occurred. So during gait, the pistoning that occurred with magnetic lock was 3.5 millimeters, which is significantly less than 1 centimeter, so great. And during pin lock, it was 4.5 millimeters. So not a huge difference, just a little bit over a millimeter. So they pretty much scored just about the same. But both of those were significantly under 1 centimeter, and that's good. So in terms of that one study, magnetic lock looks pretty good in terms of pistoning. Now, they also looked at some other things. They tested the maximum amount of tractive force that the magnetic lock and pin lock could withstand before failing, with pin lock having 580 newtons, which is a lot, and magnetic lock scoring around 350 newtons. Both of these are more than enough, since it's considered to be most people will only require around 90 newtons of 90 newtons of maximum tractive force that they go through during gait. So ideally you would want significantly more than that, but even magnetic lock is still almost 4 times more than that. So like that seems to be quite solid there as well. Now we had some other studies looking at this same thing. So in a different study, we actually did something interesting where they added weight to a prosthesis and then slowly removed the weight. So they added in increments, like went up and then they went back down. And in that one, they tested magnetic lock, pin lock, and suction. And as the weight was added, suction pistoned the least, which is to be expected because it's largely considered that suction creates the best fit out of these options anyway. And then magnetic lock was the next best, and then pin lock. Although magnetic lock and pin lock were pretty similar, just like in the previous study. And suction was significantly better than both of those. But what was kind of cool was as they started taking the weight back off, the suction suspension didn't get any better. Like it pistoned and then it did not, well, I guess it didn't piston. There was displacement and then it did not return at all, which that does seem to make sense. Pin lock, it returned just a little bit, but for the most part stayed displaced. But magnetic lock actually completely undid its displacement. Like it went right back to where it was, which is a cool factor and does make sense because the magnet is always pulling. So it actually was able to pull the prosthesis back up. And that's kind of a nice little add-on, I guess you could say, where if you were out and about and you happen to catch your foot on something and kind of have more displacement than you would normally, it's possible here that with magnetic lock, you could actually just continue walking. It would just fix itself on its own. Whereas with the other types, you would have to go and sit down, take it all off, put it back all on, make sure that you had really good suspension again. Whereas magnetic lock would actually, at least in theory, be able to fix itself, which is a nice little bonus. Now, on to some other studies that included hook and loop. They had another one where they tested how much how much tensile force it could withstand, similar to the previous one with magnetic lock and pin lock. And on this one, hook and loop could resist 490 newtons. So less than pin lock, but more than magnetic. And we already determined the magnetic was more than enough already. So quite solid there. And they had another study where they measured displacement that occurred during 30 seconds of tensile loading. So this is pretty unlikely to happen where you would just stand with your leg off the ground for so long, but it could in theory be representative of longer walks or some things like that. So for hook and loop, there was 4 millimeters of movement between the socket and the liner, which was the smallest, and that's pretty nice. Suction was the next smallest at 7 millimeters. And of course, not having or still underneath 1 centimeter is nice, like we mentioned. But it is kind of good to see that hook and loop was as small as it was. And then pin lock and magnetic lock were 18 and 12 millimeters respectively. Although it technically wasn't movement between the liner and the socket, and it was technically movement of just the liner itself stretching, but the end result is the same. So then there was also a study that tested a hook and loop, but it was a modified hook and loop. So the result is pretty much the same, but this hook and loop is actually built into the liner. So it's kind of like how a locking liner where the pin is built into it. The hook part of the hook and loop is built into the liner. It was a prototype liner. So it's a slightly different, but more or less the same. And in that study, they found it was quote unquote comparable to pin lock suspension in terms of pistoning. And it allowed slightly more than the original hook and loop, but more or less the same. So in terms of pistoning, hook and loop looks really good, and magnetic lock still looks quite solid, still looks at least as good as pin lock, if not a little bit better. So in terms of pistoning, both of these types of suspension are looking good. So on to our next factor, which is weight of suspension system. So we obviously want a low weight suspension system because higher weight is going to increase patient energy expenditure, which is not good. And I actually found one study said that many patients will complain about the discomfort they have on their residual limb due to excessive weight, even if their prosthesis is half the weight of a natural limb. So even if your prosthesis is quite light, it might still not be light enough. So really you want something that's as light as possible while still obviously being strong enough. But the strength we're not looking at because these types of suspension aren't really going to be different in terms of their strength for holding up during stance phase. They're just to prevent pistoning and all that jazz. So looking at weight of different prostheses, we found that hook and loop was the lightest, which is nice and does kind of make sense because it's literally just hook and loop. That's the only thing on there that needs to be suspended. And then suction was just a little bit behind that, so also quite light, but pin lock was heavy, and we all know that pin lock is heavy, so that does make sense, but magnetic lock was even heavier. So that does not look great for magnetic lock. That's probably going to be more uncomfortable for patients and a bit harder for them over time. So that is a significant drawback for magnetic lock, but hook and loop still looks very solid in that category. So next category, we have the pressures that one's limb undergoes during gait. So this was a little bit of an interesting category, but what we want to avoid is uneven pressures and significantly high pressures. So an example of an uneven pressure that's pretty common is that milking effect, where there's significant amount of pressure on the proximal portion of your limb and on the distal portion of your limb. And that is quite uncomfortable for patients and can be problematic in the long term. So that is something we want to avoid. We want to have an even distribution of pressure, and we would ideally want to have slightly less pressure, because the more pressure we have, the more likelihood that we're going to cause some sort of decreased blood flow to the residual limb. And since most of our patients are dysvascular, we definitely don't want decreased blood flow to the residual limb. So if we can get away with less pressure on it, that is something that's good. So we have some studies here, and they put pressure sensors inside the sockets to measure the amount of pressures and all that jazz. So first one looked at magnetic lock versus suction, and found that, and pin lock, excuse me, and found that magnetic and suction were much better at evenly distributing the pressure. Unlike the pin lock was much more likely to create that milking effect, which we all know. And the magnetic lock, however, the magnetic lock actually had significantly lower pressures than suction, which is a benefit. So something else to keep an eye on. So we have some more studies in here. One study actually looked at the patients when going up and down stairs and up and down ramps. And that's just because that's not as common to look at those kinds of things. So it is nice to look at that. And for this one, you had similar results, magnetic lock having that even distribution of pressure and having lower pressure. Now, and then we had some other studies looking at hook and loop. So hook and loop was tested against pin lock, and hook and loop resulted in slightly less pressure during stance phase, which is a little bit surprising, but we're really not even caring all that much about pressure during stance phase, care about pressure during swing phase. And during swing phase, pressure in hook and loop was less than half of the pressure from pin lock, which is quite significant. So hook and loop was better there. Also, hook and loop resulted in evenly distributed pressure, which is pretty nice. And the researchers from that particular study actually compared it to suction suspension. So that's good. And because it was also so low in pressure, it could actually theoretically be even better than suction in terms of this particular factor. Both of these seem to be pretty good, magnetic lock and hook and loop. They did pretty well in terms of the amount of pressures of both evenly distributing it and having relatively low pressures overall. So looking all right there. Next category or factor to look at is function. So obviously function, huge deal. You want your patients to be able to function really well. That's kind of the whole goal of a prosthesis. So in this one, the way that they measured it was through GDI, which is kind of similar to GVI from gait class. GDI is gait deviation index, when I think GVI was like gait variation or variability index, but it is more or less the same. However, it's graded on an opposite scale from GVI. With GVI, it was like the lower your score, the more symmetrical your gait was and better it was, with 100 being about average gait. And GDI still has 100 being about an average gait, but the lower your score, the worse it is, the more asymmetrical it is. So in theory, if you could get your score above 100, then you would be super symmetrical. You would have no gait pathology. It would be great. So that's just to understand these numbers coming up. So And the study looked at magnetic lock versus pin lock versus suction, and these are all scores that are pretty low. It is to be expected with transtibial amputees, especially some of these amputees are not familiar with all of the forms of suspension. So that's an important thing to note. So magnetic lock scored 39.8, pin lock scored 40.5, and suction scored 43.3. So really not a huge difference between there. The researchers actually mentioned that this difference, even between the magnetic lock and the suction, which was the biggest difference, was still not considered to be statistically significant. So that looks good. And I don't believe any of the patients had actually had experience with the magnetic lock suspension. So some of that variability in their gait could be due to the novelty of it. So in theory, their GDI could have been even slightly higher with the magnetic lock suspension if they had had more time to practice with it. But even as it is now, it's still basically the same as pin lock and not far off from suction. So decent there. We did not have any studies, or at least I couldn't find any, that looked at hook and loop suspension on GDI. So that is a gap on the research that ideally would be filled or in the future. And we can always speculate now. So those are basically all of our qualitative measures, or our quantitative measures, things that you can measure. So now we're going on to the qualitative measures, basically things that the patients tell us in terms of how difficult, and this first one is how difficult they were to don and doff, something that we can't measure, but we can have the patients tell us. So obviously donning and doffing, very big deal. If the patients can't don and doff it easily, there's a likelihood that they may end up not using it. And that's awful. We want them to use it. So we want ease of donning and doffing for sure. So the first study compared magnetic lock to pin lock and suction. And on this scale, they graded with 0 being the worst and 100 being the best. So 0 being it's impossible to take it on or put it on, take it off. And 100 being it's the easiest thing in the world, doesn't affect me at all. So magnetic lock scored 79.7. The pin lock scored 71.4 and suction scored 57.2. So suction scored pretty low here. And we knew that suction was definitely harder to don and doff than these other types, but this, at least in this study, showed that it was much, much harder for these patients to don and doff than pin lock. And they found that magnetic lock was actually even a good bit easier to don and doff than pin. And theoretically, that makes sense because you don't even have to line up the pin. You just have to stick your residual limb in there. The magnetic portion is already on the end of your liner, and the other magnetic portion is on the end of, well, it's kind of like a lock at the bottom of your socket. So it's just as easy as pin, but then even a little bit easier because you don't have to line up the pin itself. So that's a nice benefit there. Another study that looked at magnetic lock compared to hook and loop, pin lock, and suction, so all four. And in this one, it had magnetic lock scoring just about the same with 79.6. Pin lock scoring just about the same, 71.1, and suction scoring just about the same at 57.9. But then hook and loop actually scored 83.3. So hook and loop was even better. So it seems pretty golden for both of these forms of suspension here. Now, we did have another study that just compared hook and loop to pin lock, and that found that hook and loop had a score of 76.7 and pin lock had a score of 75.3. So hook and loop still being easier, but just barely easier than pin lock. So there is going to be a significant amount of variability between patients because what's easy to one patient might not be easy to another patient. So it is important to note that for sure. But even at hook and loop's worst, it was still better than pin lock. And at its best, it was better than every other type. So that looks good there for sure. And there was the other study looking at the modified hook and loop, and that said that that was basically the same as Pinlock, although Pinlock was slightly better, with Pinlock scoring 82.5 and modified hook and loop scoring 79. So all of these both hook and loop and magnetic lock look good. At their worst, they're still significantly better than suction and seem to be either better or right around the same as Pinlock, which is all that they really need to be. They don't need to be the best thing since sliced bread. They just need to be comparable with the worst of the main three that we look at, because that's all they're looking for, is trying to see whether or not they could be used in the future. So next qualitative factor that we're looking at is the sound that the suspension system makes when it's being used or being done and off. So this has the same score, with 0 being made the most noise and was extremely bothering, and 100 being made the least noise and was not bothering at all. So 100 is typically basically no noise. And in a study comparing all 4 suspension systems, hook and loop scored the worst at 66.9, then Pinlock with 70.3, then magnetic with 80.1 or 2, and finally suction with a 96.5. So suction scored really, really well here with sound, and that seems to make sense to me. Suction never really made any noise. However, hook and loop did not do well. And we all know what Velcro sounds like. Velcro can be annoying, so that does make sense to me. Pinlock, that also makes sense. A lot of patients don't really like the sound of the loud clicking. Like they like the sound, or some patients like the sound in terms of knowing they got in, but in general, the sound is kind of annoying. So that makes sense generally as well. And magnetic scored pretty well here, because it really shouldn't make any noise when you're walking, and should really only make one click when you put the prosthesis on. It should make the one click of the 2 magnets coming together, and then that should be it. So that also makes sense why it scored pretty well there. Another study had hook and loops scoring poorly with 70, and Pinlock scoring slightly better with 72. And another had magnetic scoring 80, Pinlock scoring 70, and suction scoring 96.8. So in this, it definitely seems that suction scores extremely high, Pinlock scores not so good, hook and loop scores even worse, and magnetic scores pretty darn good. So magnetic does pretty well here, but hook and loop, this, at least as of yet, appears to be its main drawback, similar to a magnetic lock's high weight. So that seems to be the main drawbacks of each of these types of suspension so far. Now, another qualitative measure is pain. Obviously, we want our patients to be in as little pain as possible. First of all, because we are generally nice people. We don't want people to be in pain. And also, if they're in pain, they're less likely to use the prosthesis and less likely to get around and have overall worse quality of life. So obviously, we want to avoid that as much as possible. So when we look at pain here, this is still 0 being the worst and 100 being the best, 100 being no pain, 0 being worst pain imaginable for these scores. And the first study had magnetic lock having a score of 90.2, suction having a score of 80.6, and Pinlock having a score of 70.6. And in another study, including hook and loop, at hook and loop scoring 87.4, magnetic lock scoring 86.7, suction scoring 80.65, and Pinlock scoring 76.3. Again, this is not representative of everybody, though, because we had another study that had hook and loop scoring significantly lower at only 79.4, and Pinlock scoring a bit higher at 77. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows for hook and loop, but it does seem to be pretty good again, where at its worst, it still seems to be better than Pinlock. And at its best, it seems to be better than everything, which is nice. So then in the modified hook and loop study, that one had actually it was graded on a reverse scale. So on this scale, 0 was best and 100 was worst. And for this one, modified hook and loop had a score of 5 plus or minus 5, and Pinlock had a score of 13 plus or minus 10. So there is some more variability due to the plus or minus, but on average, modified hook and loop was significantly better than Pinlock there as well. So hook and loop may be a little bit more variable, but it seems to be still quite good even at its worst and very, very good at its best. And magnetic lock seems to be very good across the board as of now because it scored either least painful or the second least painful in every study we looked at. So that's pretty good for that suspension type there. Oops. And on to our last qualitative measure, and that is overall satisfaction ratings. So this is just patients were asked at the end of their surveys just to be like, what grade would you give the form of suspension out of 100, 0 to 100, 100 being it's absolutely perfect, 0 being it's the worst thing ever, I never want to see it again in my life, kind of thing. So for those, in our first study, magnetic lock scored 83.1, Pinlock scored 75.9, and suction scored 63.14. So suction not so good in this study specifically. Another study had fairly similar results, but also included hook and loop, with hook and loop scoring 80.2, magnetic lock scoring 79.6. Pinlock actually scored significantly higher here with 83.4, which is a little bit surprising to me. And suction scoring not so good again at 64.6. Now we had another ones comparing just hook and loop and Pinlock, and that one had hook and loop at 78.7 and Pinlock at 76.3. And then finally, in the most recent with the modified hook and loop, we had that hook and loop system scoring 79 plus or minus 5 and Pinlock scoring 80 plus or minus 4. So I was definitely a little bit surprised by these because in most of the other factors we had looked at so far, Pinlock had not been scoring so well. It had been pretty much at the back of most of the measures so far. And yet here it was either the best or the second best in everything that we looked at. It seems that patients still really liked Pinlock despite its problems. And that just really goes to show how much you really need to listen to your patients, because it might look like to you that it's like it just slaps you in the face that Pinlock does not look so good. And then the patients are just like, no, Pinlock feels great. So it depends. And it could also be due to how used to a certain suspension type they are, since Pinlock is a relatively old type and there are a lot of patients, pretty much every patient starts with Pinlock also. So there are a lot of patients out there who are pretty used to using Pinlock, and it might be that they have just gotten used to the problems of it and they're totally willing to deal with that, and they like it due to its familiarity rather than the other ones not having some of the same problems as Pinlock, but they just don't like them because they're new and weird. So they would rather stick with Pinlock. So it's just important to know and look at what your patients really want and not just what they say in terms of pain, but just really asking them, what do you really want? So that's good to know there. And then before we conclude, I just want to mention this. It doesn't have pretty much any research on it at all, but it is something I did want to mention. And that's that Pinlock and suction have both been considered to be slightly problematic by some researchers due to the milking that Pinlock causes and the significant pressures that suction causes, and both of those resulting in progressive volume loss due to exacerbated atrophy. So basically your limb losing size at an accelerated rate. And these researchers think this is negative because the faster that you lose that size, the quicker you become very bony And the bonier you are with your residual limb, the harder you are to accommodate. And the more difficult it will be to get really good suspension, a really good fit, and everything to be really comfortable. So in theory, that makes a lot of sense. And these researchers state that in their eyes, it's in everybody's best interest to maintain residual limb volume as well as you can. And it has been theorized that magnetic lock suspension would not cause that same kind of accelerated atrophy as either suction or pin lock, and would allow patients to retain more residual limb volume over time. However, there's no studies that I could find that actually purported that or actually able to back that up. So that's just the researchers kind of spitballing right there. Like they think, but until we have some studies, I wouldn't say that that's a major benefit of magnetic lock. And they didn't say anything in terms of hook and loop either. So can't really claim that that's a benefit for hook and loop either. But that is a possible negative of suction and pin lock, and just something to keep an eye on for future research, hopefully. Now, on to our big finale. So the research so far out of what we have seems to actually suggest that hook and loop and magnetic lock are suitable options. However, there is a lot of gaps in this research, and I think that with significantly more research, it would make a whole lot more sense to have them as suitable options. And as of now, they don't seem to be bad options, but at least in my opinion, don't quite have enough evidence to warrant them being used right now. They do have enough evidence to warrant more research for sure. They have scored quite well in pretty much every category, but there's just too many gaps in the research right now, in my opinion, to have them being used on a wide scale basis. So let's go over some of those gaps. One first big gap would be that none of the studies looked at anything with higher impact for these forms of suspension. So the highest impact that we looked at was walking at a normal pace. That is not high impact at all. So ideally, we could look at something like jogging, or a little bit less so, just like walking at an accelerated rate, or some sort of style that could possibly simulate hiking. Maybe something like that would be nice to look at. And we can theorize based on the piston research that these suspension types might not have a good enough fit for higher impact, but we don't have any evidence to say that they would be good for it, and we don't have any evidence to say that they would be bad for it either. So until we have something, we're really just kind of shooting in the dark, and that's not good there either. And even though higher impact activities are not done by the majority of amputees, it would be another area in which these suspension systems could possibly be used in the future. So that's definitely an area we need to be looking at. Another area that we would have to look at is long-term studies. So all of these studies that we looked at were pretty much just on the day, like, oh, you walked in this all day, how does it feel? How do you like it? Or you walked in this for a little bit, how much did it piston just right now? And while these studies are great, it's good to have them, we want longer term studies. Ideally, we want studies spanning months or even years, but at minimum, we want studies testing at least weeks. And we don't have anything like that right now. So if we had something like that, it would be a lot easier to see the durability of these suspension systems. So how will they not only hold up, but how well they actually perform way down the line. We know that hook and loop for like Velcro wears out over time. How long would it take to wear out? We don't know that. How long will it take to wear out for a heavier patient versus a lighter patient versus a patient who walks more versus a patient who walks less. We don't know any of that. And it would be really nice to have some longer term studies to show things like that. Additionally, how patients perceive their different types of suspension could end up changing over time. You could have patients where at first they didn't like it because it was new, and then over time they get used to it and they're actually like, no, I actually like this a whole lot more than I used to. Or you could have patients who at the beginning, they didn't really notice that one thing was kind of bothering them. And then over time, as it gets worse and worse, they think, actually, no, this thing is really bothering me and I don't want to wear this at all anymore. So that is another area that you really need to look at for longer term. And since these suspension types are going to ideally last like 5 years, you want longer term studies to look at and see how well they could last over that time. Because if they last really well for a few months, that's not good enough. Like, we want something to be able to last those 5 years in order for it to be up there with suction and vacuum and Penlock. So another problem with this current research is that the majority of these studies were actually done by the same group of researchers. Now, that's not to say that these group of researchers are falsifying their results or they're lying to all of us or anything. But when the same group of researchers are the only ones producing these kinds of results, it is a bit worrisome. So if another group of researchers could come out and replicate their results, it would make the results look so much stronger, and it would just be much, much better for these types of suspension if another group of researchers were able to replicate their results. Up until now, we don't know. We haven't really seen anything. So if another group of researchers tried it and then could not replicate their results, then we would have some very solid evidence to say that maybe these are not good forms of suspension. But if we had another group of researchers say that they could replicate their results, boom, we can move forward with other types of studies. So similarly, each of these studies were performed by these researchers, only had a handful of patients. Most studies had 10, 12 participants. Like, that is just a very, very small sample size. And the differences in terms of amputees, both in terms of residual limb length and shape and volume and all sorts of things, as well as how well they like certain types of suspension, all sorts of things. There are so many vast differences when it comes to that we really need to have more research on larger sample sizes of patients. Now, I do realize that there are not that many amputees out there. It's a pretty small group. It's much smaller than just the average amount of people, and it's harder to get them for studies. So I won't say that you need to have a study with 1,000 amputees in it, but you can't just be able to say that these suspension systems are solid based off of a few studies that used 8 to 12 participants. We need some more participants in there. I don't know how many off the top of my head. I'm not really sure, but we would definitely need some more. So that's another area where if the research were stronger there, then we could probably point and say that these types of suspension could be used. But without that, it makes us a little bit more hesitant. So if those areas could be shored up by more research, then I would say that hook and loop and magnetic lock definitely deserve a place among Penlock, suction, and vacuum. But as of now, I would say probably not go out and use them on all sorts of patients, but they definitely do warrant more research. They have performed pretty well as of now. So with more research, hopefully we could get a much better view. So that's about all I have. These are all my references down here. They're not exactly exciting, but there they are. So go ahead and leave me some questions and stuff. Peace.